Hey everyone, welcome to episode 7 of the Code and Pixel podcast. My name is Adekunle and I'm joined by my co-host Kelly. Hey Kelly, who are you talking to today?
Hey Adekunle, we are joined today by Mae Capozzi. So Mae, why don't you tell us a little bit about Amplitude and what your role is there?
Sure. Yeah. So I've been working at Amplitude for about a year and a half now. I work with a great team. I think Jack was on your podcast or before. So Jack is my boss, Jack McCoy. I work with him, and I work with Jimmy and Meredith. That's the whole team. We've been working on the design system at Amplitude for probably about two and a half years now. Before Jack kind of started this version of it, there was like a component library that existed, and we've just been working to systematize it and try to drive like architectural consistency across like the front end since then.
Very cool. Does your design system have a name?
Yes, it is called Cerulean, which my understanding is Amplitude's brand color was once Cerulean. That is no longer the case. So that's a good reminder that maybe it's time to revisit that name. I know there's like a lot of discussion on Twitter about like naming your design system. I'm pretty pro like calling it Amplitude Design System rather than something fancy. Although I do like Datadogs is called Druids, and I think that's kind of cool.
Yeah, I always love the topic of do we name our design system? And I like I don't like ambiguity, so I like the exact name. Uh,
Yeah, it's a great way to get stuck before you even start, I think.
I find it funny that like in most cases it's usually coming from design that we're like you should name this something. Because I think in my last company we named it our at Melcher we named it Wink and it was like people were like oh that's a pretty nice name and it's good for marketing purposes, but I can see why it could be very like you can name it one thing and then it'd be like, well, we have to change the name or we just like kind of leave it. So, but I love the idea where I just call it like company design system. Keep it simple.
Yeah, I worked at Harry's, and we had a design system as well as like some other just kind of like front end tooling, and we called it the Forge. And people definitely knew what that was, which was cool. So I guess it doesn't really matter what you're called, what it's called, as long as people know what you're talking about. But I think it's a little easier for new people to know what you're talking about when you're specific.
for sure. So Mae, could you briefly walk us through your career and any different roles you've had in the past?
Sure. So I have been a software engineer for 6 or 7 years now, I think. I started out doing just like regular product engineering, mostly in New York City. Uh, and then I ended up consulting for American Express in 2018, and they were talking about building like a component library. And so that was my first introduction to something adjacent to design systems, or some like artifact of design systems. I got really interested in this idea. And when I stopped consulting for Amex, I ended up joining Harry's, where I helped build the like initial version of this component library called the Forge. So I ended up being the person who built like the initial mono repo and like decided how we structured our packages and how they were versioned and published and like set up all that tooling. And I was at Harry's for about 2 years. Then I did a brief stint at Better Mortgage, where I worked on the design system team there. And then I ended up leaving and going to Amplitude to work specifically on the design system, which I've been doing for about a year and a half now. I joined in June of 2021, I believe. Yeah, so I've kind of gone through. Now I think my title is like senior software engineer on the design systems team at Amplitude.
Very cool. I love that you have like different industry backgrounds and but yeah, like this common thread of like design system or like components. I was just curious, like, do you see like any real big differences, or is it all kind of like roughly the same from team to team in terms of like what you're trying to do and how you approach systems work?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. I I often think about how I just got really lucky around like 2017 and 18 when everybody was kind of trying to decide like, are we gonna use Angular or React? And then like, are we gonna use like what are design systems? They obviously existed long before then, but they kind of became like something that people who weren't at just like the biggest possible companies became interested in. And I just got really lucky with like the bets that I made at that time. Like I was like, okay, I'm gonna go all in on front end engineering. I'm gonna go all in on React. And then I was like, I'm just gonna really go all in on design systems. And like going all in on front end and React, like it didn't take long for me to realize that that was like a good bet. Like it was pretty, it only took like 6 months to a year for me to be like, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. In terms of going all in on design systems, like I feel like I've had an opportunity to really like grow with the discipline. Um, and so it took a longer time for me to realize like, yes, like even though this is very niche and there are fewer job opportunities necessary, like in this area, like it's definitely growing and it's like really valuable to me to be kind of like a expert in that niche. And so because I feel like I've really grown along with the practice, like every experience I've had working on design systems has been like super different. And I think that's because like the there's just so much gray area in how you like approach systems work depending on like the company and the industry, but also there just was absolutely no like agreement on like best practices, I think back in 2017 2018. Would you say that like you found that as well?
I would say I I've always kind of gravitated to fintech, which is a really weird.
Mm,
I don't think I would have ever said that, but I've always just been fascinated by like tables, order, like rules, numbers,
mm-hmm,
like how things work in that regard. So knowing things like, hey, if you're comparing a bunch of numbers, you want to right align it, the overlap between like numbers, components, UI, front end has been great. Adekunle,
yeah.
how about you?
Yeah, I would say that I got into the space because I was working on this. It was actually a fintech product, which was kind of hilarious. But I was working on this product, and there was always questions about what color button we should be using. Like, what is the
Hmm.
best practice for this? And I was like, okay, there has to be some way we could do it where we just like do it once, and everyone should follow it. And this is the thing where it was like, even before the day, it was like they're talking about like style guides, and I was like, well, style guides seem feels kind of different. So this is where it came from.
Hmm.
Design systems, where it's like someone kind of talked about it as like purpose driven um, UI. So no matter if it's a button or whatever like that, there's always a purpose. Like you're gonna use this button because of X, Y, and Z. And that's kind of how it kind of got me, where it's like we're doing a case where if I want to take an idea from concept to completion, because I like to like I was like doing a lot of product design and prototyping. I want to basically grab whatever we have in a design system and not really have to think about like the details of it. So that's kind of how I kind of got into it. And I think one thing I've noticed, especially with like fintech, is that a lot of times there's a there's a lot of dashboards, and with a lot of dashboards, there's a lot of data, and
Hmm.
that's where design system plays a good role because when you have that like overwhelming amounts of data, you can use design systems and like style guides to be able to kind of tell that story and make it easy for people to parse that information. So that's kind of where I kind of think about when I think of like how I got into it, and the reason why I enjoy it, because it's always like challenging to be able to solve these like global issues that makes other people's lives easier.
Hmm. Yeah, I think that makes sense. Like I feel like Amplitude is sort of, it's not obviously not fintech, but like the analytics space as well is like you're just trying to manage so much data and represent it in a way that's like parsable by like your expert users, but also like new users, um, and like trying to drive consistency across the way that like data is represented and laid out across the product, like helps people understand it more quickly without having to also like try to understand these like quirks in your product as well. So yeah, I feel like um, very data driven products are like a really good place for design systems to thrive. Something interesting that I found is like I've worked on e-commerce as well, and like the it was just a really different situation. Like working at Amplitude, the goal is to really strive for like consistent, simple design across like multiple products under the Amplitude umbrella. Whereas at Harry, when I worked at Harry's, the goal was to drive like a multi-product system that had like really, really different design elements, but really similar like functionality. So every single product did the exact same thing, but looked totally different. Whereas at Amplitude, every product does something completely different, but needs to look similar.
Yeah, I think that's interesting because I think there's a point, especially when you're like, if your product is one specific thing, like it's very clear for like how the UI should interact, and I think it makes it easier for design systems. But once you get to a point where it's like, all right, we're going to have 10 different products, and they're going to have their own different visual styles, and they might use different frameworks. That's where it gets like super complicated,
Hmm.
to the point where it's like you're trying to make these decisions, but also like you try to lean more towards like flexibility versus like if you're only like doing like one product, it's more kind of case of like making people's lives easier. So, but I think kind of how you like mentioned that it's like kind of interesting to kind of think about like the way the product is going to basically dictate how the design system is going to be built out.
Yeah, and I think that ultimately either way, it really comes down to like the architecture of the like data, like the style layer, like which we might call design tokens, um, and the component architecture. And like there are many ways to refer to that. I tend to call it like building in layers. Sometimes I try to picture like a wedding cake. Um, but at Amplitude, we call that pattern like specifically the base and variance pattern. There are a lot of like potential implementations of it, but the way I usually think about it is most design systems right now have like a design tokens layer where you encode like the style data across different themes. And then on top of that, there's usually like a very flexible composition based component layer where you might have like a button based component that can do pretty much anything you could imagine a button base could do. Like you can tweak the borders, you can tweak the background colors, you can tweak all of the interaction states like hover and active. And then there's usually like a layer on top of it that's really, really, really strict. Um, we call that the variance layer at Amplitude, but it could be like a really brand specific layer. Like this one is specifically for when we sell men's razors. Um, or it could be like everyone has to use this really strict layer, but if a new variant is introduced, we can take what like something from this more composable base layer and make the very specific variant from there. So like I don't I do read a lot and I've like thought a lot about, do we want more like configuration type of interfaces or composition type? And at the end of the day, I think that you actually need both. And it's more about like what layer of your system do you expose publicly?
Gotcha. That actually leads to our next question, about component interfaces, because I feel like this is probably the biggest challenge facing when you're like trying to build a public facing UI.
Hmm.
And I'm wondering, like, from your perspective, because I know you have a blog article about it, is that like, when should you use like more of that like configuration kind of style versus composition? And also like, feel free to give like explanation for folks that don't have no idea what like composition versus configuration model means.
Sure. Okay. Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, so configuration, like when you take a more configuration approach, it usually means that um, modifications and variations to a certain component are driven by pulling different levers, which is probably done by like passing different props to the component. So if you had like a very configuration based button component, um, you might only have one or two or 10 max, like different levers that you can pull to make it look different. And like the vision usually behind this type of approach is that you want to make sure that everything, all the components that people are using, like match the current design language as closely as possible. On the totally other end of the spectrum, you might have uh, a more composition-based approach, and this is when you can basically, generally what I see is like there's almost purely functionality only in the component, and then you can override styling completely, like via class names, via style prop, um, or via any other type of mechanism that's like built in. We usually might call that like an escape hatch. Um, in the past, like I definitely was all for composability. I think that came from my experience specifically at Harry's, where the goal really was to create like super unique brand experiences with this like one design system. So it was very difficult to, or it was pretty much impossible to do that with like a configuration based approach. Um, on the other hand, like what I'm learning more recently at Amplitude, or where I'm starting to land, is like there's this kind of gray area in between. Um, and to me, like the best way to reach that is this like building in layers approach, where you have a very composable layer that, like at Amplitude, for example, like it's not exposed to everybody. They can't access those really flexible components. Some, like if I were doing this at Harry's, like I would make it available, because it's impossible for one kind of like centralized team to build every single possible variant for every single possible brand. But at Amplitude, like that's not the case. So we do have this like really strict, more configuration based variant layer on top of it. So I think my perspective on this has like evolved over time, especially like I think Jack has really guided me to think a bit differently about it. With the real like drive being, we're not trying to build for the current design. We're trying to like build a system that makes making changes to design really easy and fast. So like the underlying fundamentals of the system have to be really strong, and we need to like build our variants in a really consistent way, so that if design decides to take a totally new approach, it's really easy to completely revamp that whole layer without having to like change everything below it. And it makes like rebranding and redesigns like much more effective.
Yeah, I love that you have that kind of clarity with what you're trying to deliver, because I see a lot of teams kind of struggle in that area about what are they trying to solve for.
Hmm.
Are they just trying to solve for getting, design to match the implementation perfectly? Is it about auditing? Is it about visual refreshes and things like that? So it's really nice to have this vision of what is the system trying to support and what are the trade-offs with in regards to various approaches. So you talked about supporting changes, supporting the evolution of the system. So that brings us to the next question. around what are your thoughts around versioning a component library? And that can be around the whole system itself. It could be about individual components. I'd love to get your thoughts around that.
Sure. Yeah, that's another great question. I've seen a lot of different perspectives on, and also I've done a lot of different things with. Um, I know that there are some like very successful component libraries that don't have any versioning at all. And for those who are like maybe aren't familiar, like designers who might not know too much about this or whatever, like when we say versioning, we mean that we're I'm specifically talking about semantic versioning, which is like a specification that defines that has it's like a I can't use the word semantic in the definition. Basically, depending on the numbers that you apply to the version, it has like specific meaning. So let's say that we're at version 1.0.0. If we introduce a bug fix, we would then move the version up to 1.0.1. If we added a new feature, we would move it to 1.1.0. And then if we introduce what we call like a breaking change, which means that people would have to like do work to make the upgrade path like successful, then we would actually bump it all the way up to 2.0.0. So, um, and that's like the very basics of it. There's all kinds of like tooling and processes that can go around like when exactly do you bump it to this new version? When you do it, like, is that a manual process or is it an automated process? Um, when you bump the version, do you just bump something for this specific component? Like if I made a change only in the button, does does every single component get bumped to a new version, or like does the whole library get bumped, or is it just this one component? So there's like all kinds of questions. I think that it's totally fine. Actually, I would say it's not bad at all if like an early stage design system doesn't have this. I'm seeing more and more that like companies are building, like especially as monorepo tooling improves, companies are building like their whole product in a monorepo. So there's not the same problem of trying to like make changes in one repo and then see them in another one. Rather, everything's kind of together. So you don't need all of that extra barrier to entry at first. And you can just like make changes to like your button component and they just automatically cascade to everything else. Clearly, that's risky. And at some point, it's terrifying because you might be, making a change to one button is actually affecting hundreds or thousands of pages at some point. And so you can get pretty far, especially if you have like really strongly typed application code. Like if everything's written in TypeScript and it doesn't have like a bunch of any's everywhere, like you can get pretty far knowing that like if you change the interface of your component that like TypeScript will catch it. Also, if you have like good regression testing, for example, like using Storybook's chromatic tool, that can give you a lot more safety around making these changes, and you maybe don't need to version for a long time. So like that's my caveat for you can get away with it, but it's scary. Um, on the other hand, I think that introducing versioning, it's like there's the benefit of like when you make a change in your library, people have to opt into that change. So they're not just like surprised by your changes, or your changes don't break something in some like far-flung area that you have no idea about, but it affects like revenue. Like that's very scary. Um, and like beyond just like those really obvious changes, I think it forces a design systems team to really think about like what changes are going into this release. Um, like what does the migration path actually look like? If I make this change, am I introducing a breaking change, and is it going to like really affect people on the team? So, um, like anything, it's like it's safer, it's slower, it's more overhead, uh, but I do think like it can be advantageous in the like for more mature design systems, just to avoid like you want to be building trust with people consuming your library, and if you're just breaking stuff all the time, like that's going to be very hard to do.
Yeah, I think it's you brought up a good point about like the you don't want to overcomplicate the process because I definitely done it where I versioned by component and it was probably like the worst thing I ever did because it was like you like make one change and it's like sometimes that one change to a component affects another component so you have to bump that up and it's just like it is a lot of work and the best experience I had was like we didn't even version it at all because it was like we don't know anything right now. We're just gonna like roll with the punches and kind of get things done.
Hmm.
So I do agree that like it's like you want to do it gradually. And I would say like if you want a version, usually when you want to do it like for per component, is that if you have like if you're supporting like 10 different products and they all have their own specific versions, I think that's where like you want to have that like complicated version process. But for everything else, I don't think it's necessary. Um, but Kelly, I'm wondering like your thoughts on that.
I mean, we just have everything bump up at the same time.
Hmm.
It in the beginning I was like, wait, then that means we're gonna have like everything's at like version 9,000. But you know, if you embrace like if you have a process and you're consistent with that process, you'd be surprised what ends up feeling natural like from the repetition.
Hmm.
And so I think documentation, tooling, things that make as much automated as possible kind of takes that extra burden off of the team to have to maintain. And May, you brought up a good point around like being intentional around releases. And one of the things that I like to look at is what does launching a new release do to adoption for components?
Hmm.
Um, for example, we use a Slack bot that announces releases. And thanks to May's fantastic Storybook Amplitude plugin, which we'll link in the show notes, we can actually see the number of visitors to our storybook. And so it's interesting to get that kind of data around, hey, we have a new release. How many people are checking out our storybook based on that? And kind of get some learnings around there. So I think all these things around releases and May touched on there are different types, patches, minors, and majors. And breaking changes, we have different tools to help with that as well. Um, and I think with different industries as well, you have different considerations around when you can do those releases. Sometimes, like for us, for at Intuit, we have to think about tax season. So having a major release go out, in the middle of when people filing taxes, not not ideal.
Yeah.
So I think it's really interesting with design systems. Our team is obviously very different than let's say a feature team, and so we have to be respectful of like when their code freezes are in place, and how that impacts our roadmap. So
Yeah. I think something else with like, especially early stage design systems is that um, you have to move slow to move fast. Like there's like with any work, there's always like an investment period, but with design systems, like that investment period is like very long compared to like your regular product engineering feature cycles. So you want like especially because you need to get leadership buy-in to um, build work on design systems in general. You want to get to like providing value as quickly as possible, which could be 6 months, like 8 months, a year. So if you think that adding versioning and publishing is going to like really affect your ability to reach that inflection point where you're suddenly like providing value, you're making like the life of product engineers easier, then I would wait. Um, Personally, I also do think though that like tooling is improving around like monorepo management. Um, I have done it a lot with Lerna, but now like tools like NX and TurboRepo have come out that make a lot of this like easier. So the barrier to entry is lower as well. So
Cool. You actually mentioned tooling like Learner and like Turbo Repo. I'm wondering, do you have any like go-to tools or processes that you like to use when like publishing like components?
yeah, a tool that I've used a lot in the past. So I've only done this with Lerna. Actually, I've kind of done like mostly custom setups, and this was usually before, like this was before Turbo Repo came out. When I was doing this at Amplitude, actually, right now we don't have any versioning and publishing, but it's something that we're really like thinking about and investigating. Uh, but in the past, like a tool that I really liked was conventional commits, which is basically like a human readable specification in your commit message where you prefix your commit message with a tag. Maybe it's like FEAT, like feat, which stands for feature. Um, and based on like how you prefix your commit, um, your system would automatically know like what type of version bump to actually commit. So if it's a feature, then it would do like a minor version bump. I just found like that was a really helpful way to like automate that versioning process where like you weren't just manually going through. There's all kinds of really great. I think like Atlassian has a really good tool as well. Um, I can't remember what it's called. Change log or something. Change sets. There's all kinds of great tools that like very large companies have built. I'm sure like Intuit has a bunch of internal tools to manage releases as well.
Yeah, this is when I do my shameless plug of talking about Auto, which is our open source tool for managing releases based on GitHub labels. So I guess like in wrapping up, May, thank you so much for being on the show. I guess um, let's kind of talk about as we're closing. Um, let's say someone is trying to get into design systems. What is one piece of advice you would give to them?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I think it's really hard to go from just being a product engineer to joining a new company as a design systems engineer, unfortunately. So I think that the best opportunity you have is if your current company has a design system, try to see if you can like do a rotation on that team or if you can like transfer to that team and at least start contributing to the design system. Um, if you can do that, like you'll gain like the experience that you need to then like interview elsewhere if you want to leave. I think also if there is no design system, like it doesn't have to be like a super full-fledged project. Like you can start doing systems thinking and systems work like within your own team or with your larger like engineering and design organizations, without it being like full-fledged. They all have to start somewhere, and they usually don't start because leadership is like, oh, it'd be great a design system. So yeah, just I think trying to get in on the ground floor of a new one or trying to join one that's currently at your organization is like the best way to get started. Yeah.
Love it. And also, like, if folks want to like follow you, how can they find you?
Sure. So they can follow me on Twitter at mcapoz. It's MCAPOZ. Or they can follow my newsletter. I write a newsletter about design systems. Um, you can find it at maycapozzi.com.
Sweet. Well, thanks again for joining us again. We're looking forward to folks diving deep into all the tools you mentioned, like Learner and Turbo Repo. I haven't tried Turbo Repo, so that's something I'm looking forward to. But yeah, thanks again. For those who are listening, feel free to follow us, Coding Pixels, on Twitter. We also have an Instagram. We'll be getting into TikTok. I don't know TikTok, but we'll figure it out. And we have our website. So Thanks again for listening, and see you soon.
Awesome. Thank you both for having me. Appreciate it.
See ya.